The first time the people of Millbrook County saw Caleb Voss load a rotting bee box onto his father's truck, they thought the kid was hauling junk out to the burn pile. Nobody thought twice about it. Old bee boxes lay abandoned behind cattle barns throughout the valley, stacked up, forgotten. Some had been hollowed out by wax moths. Others had collapsed after years of weathering the rain. Caleb asked 3 farms if he could take their boxes. All 3 nodded without hesitation. Who would want to keep a bunch of dead bee boxes? Then he asked a 4th farm, a 5th. By the time the snow on Miller's Ridge had fully melted that spring, the 17-year-old had collected over 40 discarded bee boxes, lined them up neatly behind the shed, as if he were building something the whole town could see, but no one could understand. One evening during dinner, his mother asked, "What are you planning to do with those dead bee boxes out there?" "I'm looking into it." Then he lowered his head and kept eating. That wasn't an answer. But for a long time, it was the only thing he gave anyone. If you enjoy stories about determination, about humble creativity in the countryside, and about ordinary people achieving extraordinary things, subscribe to our channel to join us every week. Before we continue, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We're always amazed at how far this story travels. Millbrook County was the kind of place where everyone's business eventually became everyone else's business. It sat nestled in a shallow valley, a 2-hour drive from the interstate, surrounded by dairy farms, dry pastures, and a few orchards passed down through 3 or 4 generations. The Voss family farmed 40 acres, pasture mixed with cash crops. Nothing remarkable. The kind of farm that survived on frugality and backbreaking work, not on scale. Caleb grew up doing chores before school and chores after school. He was quiet, observant, the kind of teenager who would rather stand and watch how a piece of machinery worked than open his mouth to talk about it. Decent grades, decent attendance. Nothing about him suggested ambition, at least not the kind adults could recognize, which made it all the more strange when he started asking about bees. It started small, a conversation at the feed store with old Harlan Petrie, a man who had kept bees for decades, until arthritis robbed the strength from his hands. Caleb asked questions that didn't sound like idle curiosity, about ventilation, about why a colony could die overnight, about what it meant when bees stopped bringing pollen back to the hive. Harlan, thrilled that someone under 60 actually cared, talked passionately for nearly an hour. Then Caleb started collecting. Each farm had its own story. Old Deweiler had lost all his colonies 2 winters before and didn't have the heart to try again. The Reyes family lost 3 colonies to what the Agricultural Extension Office called colony collapse disorder, a mysterious phenomenon in which worker bees vanished without a trace, leaving behind the queen, larvae, and honey fully intact, with no one able to determine the cause. Some boxes had rotting wood. Some had been clawed open by raccoons searching for larvae. All of them were considered worthless, but one of the Reyes' boxes turned out to be salvageable, and it became the first colony Caleb brought back to life. Proof, even before he fully believed it himself, that something written off as gone could still have something left to give. Caleb didn't think they were worthless. He just hadn't said why. The town noticed the shed filling up before they realized what he was actually doing. Dylan, his best friend, asked him point blank one afternoon, while mending a fence, "You're not seriously planning to start a bee farm with those junk boxes, are you?" "Already doing it," Caleb replied. "That's not an answer. But it's the only one I've got." Dylan stopped asking, because Caleb had that look he got when he'd made up his mind. No amount of talking would move him. What nobody knew at the time was that Caleb was chasing an idea he couldn't yet fully articulate himself. It was taking shape, bit by bit, in a beat-up spiral notebook stuffed in his jacket pocket. Pages filled with sketches, measurements, notes copied from beekeeping books at the library, printed materials from the Agricultural Extension Office, and a list of questions, meant for the only man in this valley who could answer them. That man was Walt Iverson, 74 years old, a former commercial beekeeper who had once managed nearly 200 colonies before his hands lost their strength and his wife made him promise to retire. Walt lived alone on the edge of town, in a house surrounded by lilac bushes and rusting equipment. Most of the kids in the valley were a little afraid of him, because he had no patience for fools. Caleb showed up at his door one Saturday morning, notebook in hand, carrying a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Was it possible to revive a dead colony by using bees from a stronger one? Walt looked at him for a long time before answering. Depends on what killed it. Sit down. That was the beginning of a relationship neither of them had expected. Over the weeks that followed, Walt became something half mentor, half perpetual skeptic, constantly challenging Caleb, refusing to give easy answers. He explained that the health of a colony could be read like a book if you knew how to look. A tight, even brood pattern, eggs, larvae, and cells laid by the queen in a spiral formation meant a healthy, well-mated queen. A spotty, scattered pattern meant trouble. Maybe the queen was failing, maybe disease. Most of what killed those colonies wasn't some big mystery, Walt said one afternoon, holding up a frame taken from a box Caleb had brought over. It was neglect. Poor ventilation in summer cooks a colony from the inside. Bad insulation in winter starves them before spring arrives. People stack supers on, walk away, then wonder why the bees can't survive. Then he said something that carved itself into Caleb's mind deeper than anything else that spring. Bees don't fail. People are the ones who fail the bees. But not every lesson was gentle. The first time Caleb tried to requeen an old colony, he failed miserably. He introduced the new queen too quickly, without giving the workers enough time to acclimate to the new queen's pheromone scent. In less than a day, the entire colony killed the queen. Walt offered no comfort. You rushed it, he said bluntly. Bees don't care how excited you are. Cage the queen. Let the bees get used to her scent for a few days, then release her, every single time. After that failure, Caleb rebuilt his entire approach around something that didn't come naturally to a teenager eager to prove himself: patience. He started small. The 3 sturdiest boxes from the salvaged pile, converted into working colonies. Bees purchased from a supplier 2 counties away. Small starter colonies called nukes, each consisting of a young mated queen and a few frames with pre-drawn comb. Nothing glamorous, just slow, meticulous work, patching rotted wood, replacing frames destroyed by wax moths, using a blowtorch to scorch the inside of boxes for sterilization before reuse. A practice Walt swore should never be skipped when working with second-hand equipment of unknown history. By early summer, those first 3 colonies were buzzing, quite literally, and Caleb began learning how to listen. The steady, low hum of a healthy colony, the shift in pitch when something was wrong. He learned to recognize queen cells, peanut shell-shaped structures the bees built when they were preparing to raise a new queen in order to swarm, and understood that catching them early could be the difference between keeping a colony or watching half of it fly off into the woods. Caleb also learned about nectar flows, the seasonal windows when flowering plants secreted enough nectar for bees to produce a real surplus of honey. He began mapping the best forage sources in the valley: clover fields along the county road, wild blackberry thickets on the Petrie property, a row of black locust trees that nobody paid attention to, but the bees were crazy about. Slowly, without intending to, Caleb was learning to see the entire ecosystem of the valley through the eyes of a creature most people overlooked: Rumors spread the way they always do in places like this. And not all of them were kind. A few old farmers scoffed that the Voss kid had lost his mind, playing around with bees when there was plenty of real farm work to be done. His uncle asked his father, half joking and half serious, whether Caleb needed to go see someone. His father, to his credit, mostly stayed quiet and let his son work, but not everyone was dismissive. Mrs. Thielders, the woman who ran the gardening club at the elementary school, started asking Caleb questions whenever she saw him hauling frames through town. Old Harlan Petrie would stop by and stand watching the hives from a distance, nodding as though he approved of something he couldn't quite name himself. Even Dylan started helping out on weekends, pulling frames, getting stung enough times that he stopped complaining about the smell of the bee smoker. Then the turning point came. Late July, the worst heat wave the valley had endured in a decade. Caleb's bees, unlike those of many long-established apiaries in the area, kept working straight through it. He had built hive stands with enhanced ventilation slots and painted the boxes in light colors to reflect heat, tricks Walt had taught him after decades of trial and error. That week, 2 neighboring beekeepers lost colonies to heat shock. Caleb didn't lose a single box. That got people's attention in a way that no amount of explaining ever could. Results spoke louder than words. By the end of July, Caleb had split his 2 strongest colonies and added more restored boxes from the salvaged pile, bringing his total to over 12 active colonies. That growth came more from careful management than from luck. A healthy colony running out of room would raise a new queen and split in 2 on its own. Walt had taught him how to seize that exact moment, turning one overcrowded colony into 2 thriving ones, rather than watching half the bees fly off into the woods. But summer wasn't done testing him yet. In early August, Caleb noticed something was wrong with one of his colonies, the one he was most proud of, one of the first he had revived from nothing. The bees looked sluggish. Fewer were flying out to forage than usual. The ones that returned came back with empty legs, no pollen baskets at all. When he pulled out a frame, his stomach dropped. Instead of a tight, healthy brood pattern, he saw scattered, disorganized cells, some capped but sunken inward rather than smoothly rounded, as they should have been. He drove straight to Walt's house, the frame wrapped in a damp cloth. Walt examined it under the light for a long time before speaking. "Could be a few things," he said. "Could be the queen is running out of stored sperm, nearing the end of her reproductive life. Could also be foul brood. And if it's that, we're not saving this colony. We burn the box before it spreads to every colony you've got." Caleb felt his throat tighten. Weeks of labor, potentially destroyed by something he never saw coming. They tested for foul brood first, a bacterial disease that could wipe out an entire apiary if not stopped in time. Walt used a rapid test kit he always kept in his truck. The result? Negative. The problem, upon closer examination, turned out to be a queen nearing the end of her reproductive life, most likely 2 or 3 years old, and slowing down in the way that aging queens naturally do. "This is the part nobody tells you about when they romanticize beekeeping," Walt said, closing the test kit. "Most of the time, it's not about the bees. It's about being able to recognize a problem early enough to still have time to fix it." Caleb requeened that week. This time, slowly and carefully, exactly as Walt had taught him from the beginning. 10 days later, the brood pattern had tightened up neatly, and the colony was foraging as if nothing had ever happened. It was only a small crisis in the bigger picture he was building, but it taught him something that carved itself deeper than any success ever had. That a thriving colony wasn't a finished project. It was something you had to monitor season after season. The same way you care for anything that's alive and worth keeping. By August, Caleb had expanded to 15 colonies, all restored from equipment other people had thrown away. He harvested real honey for the first time that month, running frames through an extractor borrowed from Walt's place. The two of them worked late into the evening, watching the golden honey spin and flow down to the bottom of the tank. It wasn't a fortune by any means. A few 100 pounds of honey, jarred in glass containers, sold at the farmer's market with handwritten labels. But it had never really been about the honey. And anyone who spoke with Caleb that fall understood that fairly quickly. What he was truly building only became clear when orchard owners in the area started asking him a question nobody had anticipated. Could winter brought its own test? No drama, no noise, just the cold and patient waiting. Walt had warned him, more colonies die in winter than at any other time of year. Not from freezing, but from starvation and poor moisture control. Bees don't hibernate. They cluster into a tight ball, vibrating their wing muscles to generate heat, slowly consuming their stored honey week by week. A colony short on honey, or plagued by condensation dripping down and chilling the cluster, could die silently in February without anyone knowing. In November, Caleb went through every colony one last time, checked honey reserves by hefting each box to estimate its weight, wrapped insulation around them, cut additional ventilation holes near the top so moisture could escape, rather than collecting on the inner cover. Installed mouse guards at every hive entrance, because a cold colony of bees was an open invitation for mice seeking winter shelter. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. He still went out to check every few weeks, brushed snow off the hive entrances, pressed his ear against the box to listen for the steady, low hum, the signal that the cluster was still alive and holding its heat. Some days, the silence frightened him more than any disease he had ever encountered. But when the first warm days of March arrived and he pried off the lid of the first box, the colony was right where he had left it, smaller, leaner after a harsh winter, but alive. The queen had already begun laying a new ring of eggs right in the center of the frame. Every single colony survived that winter, all of them. Walt, a man who had lost colonies most winters throughout his career, even at his most careful, admitted it was one of the best first-year survival rates he had ever seen in an apiary. That spring, as the trees began to bud, Caleb moved his 8 strongest colonies to the Deweiler orchard for the bloom season, the very farm that had given up on beekeeping years before, after their own colonies had collapsed. Old Deweiler stood watching the delivery, arms crossed, saying nothing. Throughout the winter, he had stopped by the Voss place a few times, never staying long, just asking a question or two about the bees before leaving. That was the highest level of curiosity the man allowed himself to show. 6 weeks later, Deweiler stood in the middle of his orchard, looking at branches so heavy with young fruit they needed propping up. He hadn't seen a fruit set like that in over 10 years. That afternoon, he drove to the Voss place, found Caleb fixing a hive stand, and stood there silently for a long moment before speaking. "Didn't think much of what you were doing with those old boxes," he said. "I know," Caleb replied. "You weren't always sure either. To be honest?" Caleb almost laughed. "Not always." Deweiler nodded slowly, looked out at the shed full of bee boxes that had nearly been hauled off to be burned, and said the closest thing to an apology that man would probably ever give in his life. "Well then, glad there's still someone in this valley who bothers to pay attention." The following year, Caleb was running nearly 30 colonies and had fixed pollination contracts with 3 orchards every spring. Harlan Petrie stopped by most weekends, just to sit and talk about bees, something he later admitted gave him a greater sense of purpose than anything had in years. Walt Iverson never stopped correcting Caleb's technique, though the corrections grew smaller and less frequent with each passing season. The valley didn't change overnight, but the way people looked at what had been discarded did. An abandoned bee box was no longer junk. It became potential. And a quiet kid, with nothing remarkable about him, was no longer someone people worried about. He became someone a few people quietly admired. What Caleb built wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a business empire or a stroke of heaven-sent luck. It was just a small, patient system. Restored hives, healthy colonies, bountiful harvests. Proof that most of what the valley had written off as worthless only needed one person willing to look more closely and ask why, instead of assuming they already knew. He still kept the spiral notebook, now filled with 3 years of records, instead of a few pages of sketches. And every spring, when the orchards bloomed and the hum of the bees filled the valley air, a few more people remembered exactly why they had once doubted him, and exactly why they no longer did. If you've ever kept bees, planted a garden for pollinators, or poured your effort into a piece of land no one believed in, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this one, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories about ordinary people building extraordinary things from what everyone else had given up on.